Thanks so much, Max. That was wonderful. And yeah, I was nodding my head a lot there. I totally agree with all those points. And yeah, very important to keep in mind if you're running workshops, which I do often. So we'll move on straight to Patrizia. Patrizia is the CEO of YWCA Scotland, a feminist organisation with over 160 years history and part of a worldwide movement of women leading change. I was lucky enough to work alongside YWCA and Patrizia recently. I can tell you firsthand what a wonderful organisation they are and how much blood, sweat and tears and other things Patrizia and the team put into such an essential cause. I wrote down also, I recently found that Patrizia's background is in archaeology. I underplayed background. She is a doctor, has a doctorate in archaeology. So that's more than a background, I say. So I assume that prompted her to share our next book, Kindred, Neanderthal Love and Death and Art, by Rebecca Ragg Sykes Patrizia.
Thank you, Andy. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. So yeah, you're getting, if you know me through my work, you're getting a very different side of me today. So this is very much my archaeology geek hat on. So bear with me. And I'm also like thinking about like what Max was saying and like trying to apply it very quickly to my talk. So if we can go to the next slide, Andy. Yeah, so this is a description of this book that I really like. A new understanding of Neanderthals, shoving aside cliches of rag-clad brutes in an icy wasteland. So these are some of the themes that we'll be exploring today. And I chose this book, first of all, because I'm really interested in archaeology, but secondly, because when I was still teaching archaeology at university, one of the first year essays that tended to be most popular with our undergrad students was kind of looking at Neanderthal anatomy, biology, culture, and kind of evidence for like social connections and like trying to assess their humanness. So like some very big questions that we gave to our first year students and some very interesting answers always. But think about like anything that we are assessing archaeologically, we're doing it on a basis that if we see something, like our ancestors maybe thought something similar about it. So if you look at something and you feel like, oh, that has like an artistic value or a symbolic value, like we apply it to archaeology, but then how about the archaeology of a different species with a different brain? Can we find those like human connections that we can recognize? And if we cannot, does that mean there weren't there? Or is just our definition of what it means to be human not flexible enough? So I will go through a couple of things, couple of kind of interesting points from the book. So if we can go to this slide, thank you. So yeah, first of all, what remains? Like, what do we know about Neanderthals? Well, we didn't know anything about them until the 19th century. So that's when they were discovered. So even though they walked the earth for about 500,000 years, we didn't know anything about them until the 19th century. What we know about them is based on 200 to 300 individuals. So I think there's around 25 people here today, 30 people. So if all of you brought 9 friends with you, so imagine like 9 friends, 9 family members, and then imagine that would be the basis of our understanding of our own species, because that's how much we currently have for Neanderthals. However, because their population sizes were much smaller, we're probably like that represents probably 0.01% of their total population. If we narrow it down, we're looking at probably 30 to 40 more complete skeletons. So within that assemblage of 300, many of them are like a skull fragment or a toe or a rib. So we are not talking about whole individuals there. So looking at the skeleton, I have a very useful comparison from the book. So on the right, you can see modern humans. On the left, that's Neanderthal. So you can probably see some marked differences straight away. So they were shorter, stockier, longer limbs, much wider chests. And then if you want to just like touch your chin and like go in here, like you feel like a bony part. They didn't have that. So that bit would be completely soft. Then if you go alongside your brow ridge, like it's not joined up and it's not extremely pronounced, and all Neanderthals, it would be very pronounced and joined up. Then if you go across your forehead, you should feel like a little bit of curve. It will be different for different people. For Neanderthals, it will be completely flat. Then if you have your wisdom teeth, or if you can feel where they are about to erupt, go over that area with your tongue. With Neanderthals, they would have like a massive gap and then their wisdom tooth, and they probably use that bit as a tool. So we see like a lot of wear on teeth on either side. So they probably used it to like work leather and things like that. But what else? Well, they also had like much bigger eye sockets. So their eyes were much bigger than ours, more photo absorbent, and they had greater light sensitivity. So they were apex predators. They probably could see in the dark much better than we can. Their ears were different to us anatomically, but all the kind of computational models that we have, and of course that's all based on bones. Like, you know, we don't have like any soft flesh preserved Neanderthals yet, maybe one day. But yeah, all the models showed that their ears were likely to have transferred and amplified sounds similar to our own hearing. So they probably would have heard similar range of sounds. Their noses were much bigger, which initially was thought to be related to like much better kind of sensitivity to smells and connected to their hunting abilities. And now that we know more about brains, it turns out that it definitely wasn't true, because the part of the brain called olfactory bulb was much smaller in Neanderthals. So that's the part that like processes smells. So that function was probably related to warming and moistening air. So their nasal structure actually resembles that of a reindeer. So they lived in cold climates, so they could take like really deep breaths, then kind of warm up that air before it hits like our very delicate lungs. There's some evidence for how things would taste to them. So there is one particular genetic marker that we share with them, which is kind of responsible for us not liking bitter and sour tastes very much. But in Neanderthals, there was another genetic marker that kind of dialed it down a little bit. So they probably could enjoy things that were sour and bitter more than we can. Okay, so next slide, Andy, if I may. Oh no, sorry. Oh yeah, this one. Perfect, thank you. So another massive question is like, did they have language? Because our entire culture, our entire social interactions are based on our ability to communicate. So they had much bigger brains than we do, which is great. But they also had, as I already told you, flatter foreheads. So they had less room for frontal cortex, which is connected to thought processes like memory and language. They had smaller cerebelli. So that's another area of brain that is connected to communication. So basically all language related zones in the brain were smaller in Neanderthals than they are in us. Having said that, the Homo sapiens that lived at the same time that Neanderthals did had bigger brains than we do. And we do not, well, we assume that there was no cognitive impairment to our brains actually shrinking. Although if you look at climate change and how we are treating the environment, like maybe there is some sort of a connection. But yeah, that fact doesn't mean necessarily that they wouldn't be able to communicate. Their throats were shaped to make similar sounds to us, so they would have ability to speak. They had similar rate of handedness, meaning that they were mainly right-handed, which in us is like also connected to like speech patterns in the brain. And there's so much evidence of them producing complex objects, like having entire cultures of like lithics, potential musical instruments, potential arts, very skilled kind of collaborative hunting. So probably some form of communication existed, but whether it was something that would be recognizable to us, very hard to say. But we know way more than we did about their ability to speak in the last kind of 20, 30 years. And then next slide, please. I feel like a really pretentious professor, like having like a teaching assistant. I mean, like, next slide, please. I've witnessed it many times in my time in academia. Violence, like we assumed for many, many years that they were quite violent. And that's based on high rate of trauma in their bones that we have, and mainly head trauma. But now having more understanding how trauma is formed, the trauma that would be related to fighting is most likely to be facial, and then above the level of ears. So if you think about someone who's been in a fight, broken nose, bruises under their eyes, probably not stuff like on their chin, kind of lower, and probably not on top of their head. Like it's really hard to like punch someone on top of their head unless they are kneeling. So there are actually only 2 really strong cases that can be linked to violence. One of them is a male individual from Shanidar, and he had chest stabbing wound so deep that it cut across the ribs. And actually the tip of the kind of stone tool that was used to inflict that wound on him was still embedded in his ribs, but they healed around that, which shows that kind of some medical care and looking after that individual also happened. And then there is a female individual from southwest of France who had a 7 centimeters deep wound to the top of her head, consisted with a sharp-edged object. So it looks like she was kneeling down and someone like hit her really hard on the top of her head with something really sharp. But again, there is evidence of that wound healing as well. It's hard to say if she actually survived, but she at least survived for a couple of weeks for us to see that. So actually compared to like evidence of our own species from the same time, not higher levels of violence at all. High mortality rates, lots of accidents probably, but also evidence of healing and looking after disabled members of community. So there is another individual from Shanidar who was the unluckiest person that I can imagine. Like he sustained so many wounds. He was probably partially blind as a result, probably impaired hearing. At one point, one of his arms had to be amputated. Presumably by someone else, because it's probably hard to do it yourself. But then it healed, and actually he lived for many, many years after that, because we see that he adapted to just using one of his arms. So there's definitely that sort of community spirit, looking after people, some kind of medical support and help. And next slide, please. So food. We used to think that Neanderthals were those just apex predators, eating mammoth and bears and big game, which is true. They were very skilled at hunting big game. But now that we have more archaeological evidence and we are more interested in looking at all the teeny tiny bone fragments and all the evidence that we can get out of that, we now have evidence that they ate everything: small game, rodents, birds, seafood, specialized hunting, just everything. And going back to like think about their bigger bodies, shorter legs, they had larger heart, larger brain, and they lived in cold climates. They needed more calories. So the estimates are that in cold climates, they would need up to 7,000 calories a day per individual, which is an equivalent to blowout Christmas binge. So if you think about like a couple of drinks and then your breakfast and lunch and then eating leftovers and maybe trifle and cake and all that, cheese board, like that's roughly a daily equivalent of what Neanderthals would have needed. 10 Neanderthals a week would need 300,000 calories, or 3 reindeer a week, which is 2 times more than average wolf pack. But of course, like being humans, they also needed more than just kind of carnivorous diets. We like to think about them as eating just meat, like all the kind of paleo diets. And I heard that the paleo diet is now called Neanderthal thin, which is the worst pun ever, but they definitely didn't just consume meat. And we now have evidence from calculus or tartar, so what your dentist cleans at like every checkup appointment. Neanderthals didn't have the benefit of that, so it would build up on their teeth. And there's evidence within that of consumption of dates, peas, lentils, roots, tubers, seeds, like all sorts of vegetables. So their diet was probably very varied. So if you want to go on paleo diet, like please do not believe that this is actually just meat-based. And then the final slide, I'll just go through that really quickly. Thank you. What do we know about Neanderthals based on our own DNA? Well, we know that about 1.8 to 2.6 our modern human DNA comes from Neanderthals. So we now have a very clear evidence of interbreeding. So there are periods of time that our species had babies together. We do not see the same evidence in Neanderthal species. So there is evidence for Neanderthal genes coming into our species, but not vice versa, which could be based on a small sample size. We don't know. And it's in all humans except for these from sub-Saharan heritage. So these are the only humans that we do not see that sort of influence of Neanderthal DNA. It is lowest for Western Europeans at around 2% or under, and it's slightly higher for indigenous Americans, Asians, and Aboriginal Australians. And what does that mean? Like, what did we inherit from them? So I'll just give you a couple of examples of things that Neanderthals passed on to our species. There is a gene protecting us from bacteria that can cause stomach ulcers. So if you had a stomach ulcer, you are not likely to have that gene, but some people do. Genes that make our hair, nails, and skin are passed on from Neanderthals. And it's possibly because they are more useful as our species expanded beyond tropical environments. So our lighter skins and being able to metabolize vitamin D better as a result of that was probably advantageous. Body clock genes, so the fact that like we respond to those like daily rhythms of like when it's sunny, when it's dark, and it's probably for Neanderthals to better cope with long winters. So naturally, like if you feel really sluggish when it's dark in the morning, that's probably from Neanderthals. A gene that affects how fats move into cells, also from Neanderthals, which in our species sadly means higher risk of type 2 diabetes, but it would have been advantageous in environments when you would go through periods of starvation, like having that better energy management. And also genes promoting fatness and connected to addictions come from Neanderthals. And it's probably advantageous kind of consuming fat-rich food and like seeking out those foods, again, in those environments, but that wouldn't be the norm. With a massive caveat that this is all based on 40 samples. So we know all of that based on 40 samples. So as we test more, we'll probably know more about that. But yeah, we all carry a bit of Neanderthal in all of us. And the final slide, just a summary of all these things. So what remains? Not a lot, but what we know through what remains is actually quite a lot. I think I will leave it at that.